Rob, great to have you on One Climate this morning.
Pleasure to be here.
Rob, it's obviously been a tremendous success, your movement, Transition Town, and it's spreading like wildfire. But tell us, how did it begin? What was the origin of it all?
Well, my background for years was in teaching permaculture, which is a sustainable design system. And so when I found out about peak oil and about climate change, the two issues kind of around the same time, I was really thrown to start thinking about how do we use permaculture thinking, a sort of positive solutions-based, design-led response to dealing with these two challenges. And what we really do in transition is to say that you can't look at climate change in isolation from peak oil, from energy security, from resource scarcity, because actually the solutions you come up with aren't sufficiently effective, and the same the other way around. So we argue that there's a space where peak oil and climate change overlap, and that what matters in that space is three things. Firstly, planning, intentionally planning as a creative collective design process of how we move forward from here. Secondly, powering down in terms of reducing the amount of energy that we consume, and we argue that one key aspect of that is this concept of relocalization, that things that we can do closer to home, particularly food production, building materials, energy generation, should be brought as close to home as we can to stimulate local economies and enable more money to cycle locally. And then lastly, the one is powering up, so putting in place a new renewable energy infrastructure. So transition has really emerged as a kind of positive solutions-focused response to what it would look like if, rather than climate change being about stopping something ghastly from happening, that actually we shift our thinking so it's more about that's where we want to go, that there's a vision of a low-carbon world which is so enticing that we're prepared to really throw our energy into making that happen.
So it's a very empowering way of looking at it, rather than a diminishment of what people are attached to as the one and only reality, the kind of consumerist society. Instead, you're kind of creating a whole new vision that people feel empowered to create. Is that right?
Yeah, I think climate change can easily create an enormous amount of fear that can be debilitating, really, and that really, if we want to, who's to say that actually how we live now is the best that humanity ever managed? What is it about how we do things at the moment that's so absolutely irreplaceable that we couldn't actually do better than that? And so,
Rob, I would say that it's clearly not the best way, given that it's only a good way, or an apparently good way, for a very small minority of people, if you think of the planet as a whole.
Absolutely, and also surely at this point in time, we've had a way of doing things which has actually pushed the entire world's biosphere to the edge of collapse, then pausing for a bit of a rethink is rather a sensible idea.
Exactly.
But I think if we try and do that based on an idea that without vision of the future that is sufficiently enticing to pull us through, it's going to be hard to bring people with us. And so, I always say it's much easier to campaign against climate change than it is to come up with a really articulate vision of how things could be. And so what transition groups are doing around the world really is to work with the communities around them to try and voice that and give form to that idea of where it could be going. But also then, visioning on its own is fairly fanciful and not very helpful in some ways. But it has to be accompanied by a process of actually working out how we get there and starting to lay the foundations for moving that forward, which is what transition groups are starting to do now around the world.
That's marvelous. But how do you sit there and you think all these things through, you have ideas coming in and you have your own experience. How did you get beyond it being something in your mind and feelings and vision to something that other people could start to accept and be galvanized by?
I think we tried to design something from the very outset which was sufficiently structured for people to feel that there was something that was kind of holding them in it, that there was something there, but also which gave a lot of freedom, a lot of permission, a sort of an invitation really to experiment and to be creative. Excuse me, that's our phone going off. Is that you can pick that up? Can you? That's a bit annoying. Can we start like?
That's okay.
Seconds?
I should keep going, Rob. Don't worry.
Right.
Keep going.
So yeah. So what we tried to do from the outset was to design transition in such a way that it gave, it's like an invitation. It gave people permission to pick it up wherever they were, and to just get started really. So we have.
So including people's own creativity rather than them having a complete prescription. It sounds like you gave people a framework and some ideas and a vision of what to aim for, or a vision of what they might be inspired by, but ultimately depends on people's own creativity.
Absolutely. And we have in transition what we call a cheerful disclaimer, which says if you're looking at transition and you're thinking here's something that's definitely going to work, we can't make that promise. Really what transition is an invitation to experiment and to be brave and to try things out and to celebrate the failures as much as the successes and to tell other people about it. It's not something that you're just going to take off the peg and it's definitely going to work, because actually transition looks very, very different everywhere. Even in London, you can have one district next to another one. Transition looks very different in each of those places. There's enough of a structure for people to feel held, but there's enough freedom within it for people to just take it, adapt it. It's like open source software. People adapt it to wherever they are, into their culture, into their surroundings. So. It's very much, I increasingly think of transition as being one of the biggest, most fascinating social experiments happening anywhere in the world, really. People all around, in the US, in Brazil, in the UK, in Italy, just picking up this model, adapting it to their own culture, their own context, and just getting going, just getting started, not waiting for permission to start this process, but just embarking on it themselves.
So it's a bit like organic agriculture, if you like. It's very organic, it's very diverse, it's very in tune with its own immediate circumstances and environment, rather than something top down. And that's of course been one of the big problems with our current economic system, that it is increasingly like a monoculture in every way, not just in terms of agriculture, but the whole way we look at the world is like a monoculture. All the things we buy are increasingly the same thing, whether you're in one country or another. All the shops are the same, all the goods are the same. And you seem to be going away from that top-down homogeneity to something much more like nature's own biodiversity, or is that taking it too far?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right. That we have lost a huge amount of diversity, cultural, economic, and we've become much more kind of homogenized in that sense. And my sense of what's happening with transition is that at the moment, as communities, as settlements, as economies, we meet each other in a way of being completely mutually dependent on each other. So because the town where I live produces virtually nothing that it consumes, and it imports 95% of its food, nearly 100% of all of its consumer goods, 100% of its energy, and the town down the road does much the same thing. Our relationship with each other is purely as consumers. And in transition, we argue that the process of relocalization is a process of becoming more producer-consumers, and that instead of us meeting each other as pretty much useless individuals in that sense, that actually what we're looking at doing is to start putting back in place a capacity, so that rather than the UK exporting 1.5 million kilos of potatoes to Germany every year and importing exactly the same amount back again, actually what needs we can meet locally we do, and that produces a population that's more skilled, better connected, healthier, happier, more economic activity happening on a local level, less reasons for our young people to leave the town when they leave school, and lower carbon emissions also, because we aren't shifting all this stuff around all over the place. So
you don't have the food miles.
Yeah, I mean, we should be talking about food feet really rather than food miles, which is perfectly possible in a lot of places.
That's wonderful. It reminds me of another parallel in our field of work, which is that people have stopped being couch potatoes, simply watching TV or reading news that comes from huge global conglomerates, media conglomerates, to being able to be citizen journalists or input their own stuff since the interconnectedness of the World Wide Web. And it makes it seem like there's a parallel that your people aren't, who are part of transition towns, aren't couch potatoes. They're producers of potatoes rather than couch potatoes waiting for other people to bring potatoes to them.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. That's good.
So one of the things, though, that when you start to do something, you find difficulties. And, you know, you may start off with great enthusiasm, but then when you hit up against obstacles, for example, obstacles in local planning laws or something, this must be very difficult. You must constantly come up against local government, mustn't you? And is that relationship a good one? Is it a difficult one? How does it go?
I think it's very different in different places. So there are some transition groups who are doing some very interesting collaborative work with their local government. In Stroud, in Gloucester here, the transition group in effect wrote the council's food policy for them. In Sunshine Coast in Queensland in Australia, they produced, the transition group there produced what they call an energy descent action plan, which is a sort of transition development plan, which has been very well received by the local council, who now have as their aims that they want to promote resilience, low oil, low carbon ways of doing things. In Montevideo in Italy, which is the first transition initiative in Italy, the council there passed the most extraordinary resolution all about promoting values of simplicity and frugality, promoting resilience and low carbon living. So there are some very interesting examples of that working well. I think in lots of places it's a struggle. Certainly where I am here in Totnes, it's not quite so straightforward politically with the council. But I think what's starting to happen is that the town is increasingly gaining a reputation for the fact that it is Transition Town Totnes. And people come from around the world to come and see what's happening here. And so increasingly the story that this town tells about itself, I increasingly think of transition not as an environmental initiative, but as a cultural initiative. And that what it does is it starts to change the story that a place tells about itself. So it's a kind of an iterative process. So the town starts doing some things, gets some projects in place, that starts to change the story a town tells about itself, that then informs the next round of stuff that it does, which again changes the story. So it gets very interesting then when the people from the council here go out to other places and they meet people in other councils who go, fantastic what's happening in Totnes, isn't it? And then they have to say, oh, well, yeah, it is, I suppose. You know, and so I think that's partly what transition does, is it's about cultural narratives and how we change the stories that we tell about ourselves. And of course, councils have a very, very, very important role to play in this. You know, we always say transition isn't something that just transition initiatives can do. You know, it also needs national government, it needs international legislation, like what should have happened in Copenhagen. It needs local government as well. But all of those things are really going to struggle if it's not underpinned by a really dynamic, empowered community response as well, because otherwise it becomes something imposed from the top. And that's much harder to do.
Absolutely. Your description there of the cultural change, the story, is something I can really see happening elsewhere as well, because the assumption that we have to live according to the old pattern is, of course, just a story too. It's just a cultural illusion which is presented as the one and only reality. And what you're presenting is a different kind of option, a different kind of reality that is self-fulfilling. It becomes the reality the more we see this story as making sense.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we've done here in Totnes, one of the big projects we did over the last year was to produce this, which is called the Totnes Energy Descent Action Plan, which is like our plan B for this place and its surroundings. So it's a kind of, it blends in very nicely to the wall behind me, I'm noticing it.
No, it's fine, we can see it.
Yeah, and it's, so it looks at food and energy and housing, and it has a vision for each of those things in 2030, backcasts how we actually got there. And in effect, it's a new story for this place in terms of how it develops. It has research in it about can Totnes district feed itself, looking at the potential of the land base around, how much energy we need, how much energy we could generate locally. But ultimately, it's a new story. It's a narrative, really, about where we move forward from here. And a lot of places are starting to do the same kind of thing.
Well, that's very inspiring indeed. It makes me want to go down again to my local transition towns embryonic movement and see what I can do too. Now, tell me something. You mentioned the Copenhagen summit and what a disappointment that was. I mean, we're broadcasting right now this week from the Tianjin conference in Tianjin in China, which is the last sort of preparatory major conference of the UNFCCC before the Cancun conference in Mexico in December, which is the the big one after Copenhagen, there is the sense that things are moving very slowly, although the developing countries are getting quite hot out of the collar, understandably, at the sense of being blocked so much, and actually wanting to push. So at the sort of high end political level, they are stirring, but there's more frustration than actual forward movement. To what extent do the people working in transition towns, to what extent are they aware of these global negotiations, and does it matter, or just focus on getting on with stuff at ground level and let the negotiations take care of themselves?
I think in transition we try very hard to be something which isn't that doesn't start from a point of trying to work out what fault everything is, and so that we can blame them for things. It's not a campaigning approach. It's not an adversarial thing or political in an explicit way. But that's not to say that perhaps a lot of people who are involved in transition aren't also involved with campaigning and so on. And I think that we need all of these strands all running alongside each other at the same time. We need international legislation and campaigning for that. We need people campaigning against the things that are taking us in the wrong way, such as new coal-fired power stations or new airport runways. But at the same time, I think one of the reasons why transition has proved so infectious over the last 3 or 4 years has been the fact that it feels very accessible to a lot of people. It doesn't have a kind of judgmental list of well, you can only join if you don't have a car and if you don't fly and if you are left politically or whatever. It's very much a broad church that draws lots of people in. But I think we desperately need something like Copenhagen or Cancun to work. But I suppose what transition is doing is saying, well, we're just going to get started. We're not going to wait for that. Actually, one of the main fears, I imagine, of the people who are negotiating is that they don't have people behind them. And actually, one of the things transition is saying is that potentially, if we can embrace this approach, that a low-carbon way of doing things could actually be a far better way of doing things than how we do things at the moment. And my sense was with Copenhagen that a lot of people who went to negotiate on our behalf, if you'd have stopped them in the corridor and said, can you describe to me a powered-down, low-carbon version of where you live in 2030? What would it smell like? What would it sound like? What would you see when you opened your window in the morning? What would you have for breakfast? What would that actually describe it to me? Paint me that picture. But a lot of the people I spoke to involved in that, they didn't have that. And my sense is that if you don't have a vision that you feel in your stomach of actually where we're going and how much more delicious it could be than how we do things at present, why are you going to make that happen? And so for me, one of the most important things that transition initiatives are doing is really painting that picture and sort of trying to get that vision out there so it starts to create a pull. So if that kind of a future should be something that pulls us towards it, not something that we're dragged into sort of kicking and screaming.
Absolutely. And I'm struck by your words painting and delicious. I mean, these are all very sensory, and people I've seen in transition towns films, for example, always doing something, where they're either outside or they're touching something, they're smelling something, they're eating something, they're growing something. It's like a reminder to go back to one's senses and not just work things out somehow, aspirations in your head, as though you're reconnecting with the natural world in a very direct way and remembering that we are part of the natural world, rather than simply beings that look at, stock exchange lists or something, or pictures in magazines of things we might desire. and somehow going back to the real rewards and fulfillments that life affords, the things that money can't buy almost, and that sense of really coming back to our bodies and the physical body of the earth.
Well, we're human beings, I mean, we are, we laugh and we cry and we do silly things and we like good food and we like,
and we bleed
each other. I think is one of the things that's happened is this, that as we become more and more fragmented from each other, there's this idea that somehow we can, that actually I think if one of the reasons we've ended up in the climate crisis is because this sort of industrial model, in spite of all the amazing things it's brought us, and I'm not, the oil age, if we might call it that, has been extraordinary in terms of what, as I've grown up, I've been able to experience and do, which previous generations could only have dreamt of, and I think it's really important to honour that. Is not to say this is a total waste of time, but I think, that the incredible ingenuity and adaptability and creativity that got us to where we are now, that created an oil age and industrial revolution in the first place, why is that going to suddenly evaporate when we have to design a safe way down the other side? And so for me, actually, rather than, you used a term there about going back, and I think that actually what we're really looking at in transition is not about going back at all in any sense. It's really about designing where we move forward from here based on the right questions and based on designing something that's actually appropriate for a world of very volatile oil prices, for a world that is actually thinks of its grandchildren in a practical sense rather than some kind of nebulous intellectual sense. Why is that genius going to evaporate when we have to start thinking a safe way forward from here? I don't think it will. And I think transition is really, Paul Hawkins always talks about the environmental movement as being like the Earth's immune system kicking in. And I think transition is one very vibrant part of that.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. That was really inspiring and full of wisdom. And I really hope the Transition Town movement keeps growing. I know it's growing, rapidly around the world now, and not just in the UK where, you started it. I hope that you will continue to develop and grow and keep talking to us about what happens. And please use all the things that oneclimate and all our partners, Tick 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 and others, are also doing. If it helps you and your Transition Towns movement to understand what's happening in other parts of the world at the political level, please take whatever you need, and we'll all try and help each other to be as creative and ingenious as possible in developing the kind of world that we really want to live in and want our children and our grandchildren to live in. So thank you very much, Rob, for speaking to us today.